Hello, I'm your host, Paul LaRoche, and this is Hidden Heritage. Over the past several podcasts, I have been narrating chapters from the book Hidden Heritage, the story of Paul LaRoche, as written by author Barbara Marjak. In Chapter 1, we reveal the childhood of Paul Summers, the son of Clarence and Irma, in the idyllic town of Worthington, Minnesota. This chapter explores Paul's discovery of his adoption, and he meets his wife Kathy and forms his early passion for music, which became a key part of his life. Chapter 2 explores the struggles Paul faced while pursuing his passion for music, conforming to societal norms of career and family. However, an emptiness persists, leading him to consider searching for his biological family. Chapter 3, Paul embarks on a heartfelt journey to meet his newly discovered Lakota family living on the Lower Brule Sioux Indian Reservation of South Dakota. This episode dives into the emotional complexities of adoption reunions and the joy of connecting with family across cultural lines. Chapter 4 gracefully weaves past and present, as his new family members recount personal stories revealing musical talents handed down through generations. By the episode's end, Paul is left reflecting on his ancestral legacy, inspired by the music in his blood and the stories waiting to be discovered. Join us now for Chapter 5 of Hidden Heritage, the book, titled Hunka Iyaya, a brief history of the Lakota over the 1800s and the story of Paul's descendants. In the year the whites called 1804, the Great Sioux Nation was made up of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota tribes, and it covered the vast majority of the northern plains. The Yankton Sioux, one of the Nakota bands, were camped near the mouth of the Jacques River in the month of Wasutanwi, when all things ripen, the hot, dusty days of August. One morning, smoke from a distant fire was spotted, and the chief sent several young boys to investigate. A short while later, they returned to the village with 3 white men, one of whom could speak their language. The white men requested the chiefs and the warriors come for an important council with the Court of Discovery at the river bluff. The Yankton chiefs first held their own council over the course of several days to discuss their options. Many of the women and children were destitute, and the leaders recognized the need to protect their people. They were concerned about their lack of firearms and ammunition and the changes in their world already transpiring. Finally, about 70 chiefs and warriors, dressed in their finest buffalo robes, painted leggings, moccasins, and war shirts decorated with porcupine quills and feathers, journeyed to meet the Corps. Carrying their bows and arrows, they arrived on the opposite side of the river bluff from the white men and set up a temporary camp. Down below, a keelboat rested along a sandbar. The white men sent over gifts of corn and tobacco. The next morning, a heavy fog hung over the river. The chiefs waited for the dense cloud to lift before crossing the shallow river as requested to hear what the white men had to say. Their 2 captains, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, stood next to a flag flying high on a staff and delivered a lengthy speech in grandiose fashion. The chiefs could tell these white men were different from the English and French traders already traversing across Sioux territory. Through an interpreter, they were told the land now belonged to the United States, and that a man far in the east, President Thomas Jefferson, was their new great father. To those who had lived on the land for countless generations, there had never been a line on the earth to distinguish that the land belonged to one and not the other. The Corps gave the chiefs peace medals and a flag, and instructed them to make peace with the enemy tribes. The atmosphere was festive with much music and food, and the Corps even performed a kind of parade. At night, the Yanktons sang and danced as they gathered around 3 fires. During their time together, the warriors proudly displayed their hunting skills for the white men. Word came that a baby boy had just been born in the Yankton's village, a boy named Pape. Lewis asked to see the infant and swaddled him in an American flag, baptizing him as an American. Despite the celebratory mood, Chief Wiyushi kept his focus and explained the desperate conditions of his people and the need for reliable trading partners. Instead, Captains Lewis and Clark extended an invitation to send a delegation to see the Great Father in the East, and continued on their journey. At that time, much of the northern plains of North America was unmistakably a Lakota world. A little further north and west along the Great Muddy, the nomadic lifestyle of the Sioux was rich and rewarding, as the small bands followed their lifeblood, Tatanka, or the buffalo, across a vast majority of the plains. The families used dogs and horses to pull their possessions on a travois from one camp to the next. When the buffalo were spotted, an entire camp could be packed on travois and be on the move in 20 minutes. Individual teepees were set up in less than 15 minutes and taken down in 3. Everyone had an important role within the tribe, which in turn supported the village as a whole. The people of the great Sioux nation maintained a lofty wisdom given to them by Wakantanka, the Great Spirit or Great Mystery. To them, the Creator, who made the world and everything in it, gave to all breath and life. A reverence for life was evident in the physical, intellectual, and spiritual dimension that carried through all of their daily lives. Every aspect of their existence revolved around the relationship with the Great Spirit. The teepee represented the universe, with the entrance facing the rising sun, and the circular home emulating the cycles of the moon and sun given by the Creator. Inside belonged to them, but the space outside belonged to the Great Spirit. The simple lodge brought humility and a willing dependence upon the Great Spirit. Even the winged ones made their nests in a circle. The sun came forth and went down again in a circle. The moon did the same, and both were round. The wind, in its greatest power, whirled in a circle across the dust-covered plains. The dances were conducted in a circle, carefully placed and usually sunwise. When the elders and chiefs gathered, they sat cross-legged in a circle and smoked the pipe. Tobacco was mixed with sumac leaves and the dried inner bark of trees, like the red willow. Sometimes in rare supply, it was usually saved for ceremonies. Such tobacco smelled pleasant and did not harm its users. Like all young boys, it was an honor for Pape to walk in the path laid out for him and learn the lessons of his father and grandfather. Pape was on his way to becoming one of the great hunters and warriors. The elements were closely related, so the providers and protectors of the village took time to show young men like Pape how to carry the bow. Through much practice and patience, he learned how to shoot an arrow straight and, equally important, how to care for his prized tool. Pape was often gone for extended periods, and no one worried, since the hours in the day were not measured into minutes or seconds. Instead, it was commonplace for a young warrior in training to come home after the lesson had been learned. Pape proudly wore a quiver of arrows across the small of his back as he set out on foot to search the creek bottoms for elk, hare, whitetail, and black-tailed deer. He enjoyed time away on his own, tracking along the river bottoms, taking cover in the shade of the cottonwood grove, or simply walking the ridge of the river bluffs. Whenever his arrow connected with a whitetail or an elk, Pape offered a bundle of prairie sage to acknowledge the gift of life for the animal killed, as he had been taught. He also thanked the animal for giving his life to give food, clothing, and tools for the people. As Pape matured and took on more responsibilities, he looked forward to when the tribes assembled for the grand buffalo hunts. In the warm summer months, other encampments joined together for a time of social interaction. Plans for the occasion brought great merriment among the people, their hearts singing with thoughts of visiting friends they had not seen in a long time. Chores were shared in the large encampments, and there was a constant exchange of gifts. The people enjoyed the prospect of quiet times and rest when the storytellers gathered the young ones around the fire in the warmth of a teepee, repeating words and actions until the stories were memorized. As a warrior, Palaniapape was often required to protect his band. On one such encounter, he traveled north of the Yanktons and became involved in a skirmish between the Arikaras, who were also called the Rees of the Upper Missouri, beyond the Brule territory. In the midst of the skirmish, Palaniapape avenged his brother's death by killing an Arikara with a spear. Because of the encounter, from that day forward, Palaniapape was known as Strikes the Ree. Strikes the Ree was painfully aware of the presence of the white man and the inevitable changes being thrust upon the entire Sioux nation. Word spread that almost the entire village of the Mandan to the north had been wiped out with the sickness from the white man in 1837. There was plenty of reason to be concerned. Not only did the whites kill people with long rifles, the chiefs surmised, but also with spots that covered the skin. Nearby, in another Yankton band, a young boy named Red Leggings was also learning the ways of a hunter and warrior. He too spent hours learning from his father and grandfather, keeping his eyes and heart in tune with all of nature surrounding him. No matter where the many bands roamed on the vast open prairie and rolling grasslands, the Sioux had one thing in common: Paha Sapa, a place of great spirituality. Located in the center of the great Sioux nation, the dark, pine forest bluffs of Paha Sapa rose unexpectedly from the enveloping prairie. The craggy hills jutted out in a wilderness shrine where the physical beauty equaled the powers of the spirits. The music of the streams called out to those who came in search of guidance from the Creator. Known as the heart of everything that is, a warrior could come to Paha Sapa alone, seeking further clarification for his purpose and calling through intense prayer and fasting. The Lakota lived in close accord with the animals, believing the Creator put them on earth to teach valuable lessons. The animals had abilities worth desiring: bravery, craftiness, and endurance. Proficiencies they had received with grace and power from the Almighty. The winged ones, the four-leggeds, the finned ones, all contributed to the fullness. It was well known that Wambly, the eagle, was a very special winged one, the only earthly being to ever see the Creator. In the spring, the prairie came alive. The Hosi Chekpa was the first flower to emerge from the dormant soil. Beavers, snapping turtles, the prairie dogs were among the critters that made their homes among the grasses, rushes, and sages. By summer, the colorful prairie flowers politely nodded to each other in the warm breezes, while soft clouds cradled the setting sun each evening. Strikes the Ree and Red Leggings, just like all the members of the Sioux Nation, participated in a spiritual lifestyle in a personal way. From their waking up to their going to sleep, Wakantanka was acknowledged through sacrifice, petition, and thanksgiving. Both Strikes the Ree and Red Leggings were well aware that Tatanka was the main source of livelihood, supplying tasty, nourishing food year-round for all ages. A favorite dish was a soup made of buffalo fat, buffalo blood, and berries. When meat was plentiful, large quantities of the lean flesh were cut into long, thin strips, dried in the sun on racks of poles, then packed in parfleche, envelopes made of buffalo rawhide. Dried meat was made into pemmican. The meat was cooked, then pounded with a stone hammer and mixed with boiled marrow grease and sometimes berries. It was then stored in bags made from buffalo rawhide. The task of butchering and skinning the buffalo usually fell to the women. After scraping off fatty tissue, they stretched the buffalo hides and pegged them to the ground with stakes. The women tanned the buffalo hides with a mixture of buffalo brains, liver, grease, and soap root. Sometimes it took as many as 10 days to prepare one buffalo hide. Life on the prairie produced a healthy, productive society. Men and women alike had strong bodies and clear minds because there was always something to do. Children mimicked adults in their play, thriving in their carefree yet secure environment. As the midpoint of the century neared, the Yanktons strived to continue their ways along the now-named James River. Through his experience as a warrior and a negotiator, Strikes the Ree became chief of his band. Many respected his foresight and continuing interest in preserving the surrounding natural resources. Many enjoyed spending time in the council teepee, sitting around the flickering fire, listening to stories he shared from long ago when only a few of the white men had been seen. Now their conversations were of a much more desperate tone because of the precarious circumstances intruding upon their beloved lands. "The white men are coming like maggots," Strikes the Ree announced to the leaders in the council lodge. "It is useless to resist them. They are many more than we are. We cannot hope to stop them." He looked at their solemn faces, expressions that revealed the inevitability of ominous changes. "Many of our brave warriors would be killed, our women and children left in sorrow, and still we would not stop them. We must accept it, get the best terms we can, and try to adopt their ways," Strikes the Ree stressed. He had been to the east. He'd seen firsthand how many whites were there and how many more were coming. A cold silence ensued as the men in the teepee listened to the troubling discussions. Some didn't want to believe it and exited, shaking their heads. Others nodded in understanding, the words cutting straight to their hearts, knowing the truth they held. Across the great Dakota Territory, the white man's ever-increasing presence brought a deep uneasiness. Stories reached Red Legging's band that many wagons and white men were headed west, following the corridor along the Shell River. By 1847, the Long Rifles and Blue Coats demanded that the travelers along that corridor be protected under the Great Father in the east. The whites referred to it as the Oregon Trail, and it cut through the southern part of Sioux Territory, bringing a steady stream of immigrants moving east to west. Curious young boys lay in the grass on the hilltops, watching the wagons and the horses pass, wondering what would come to be. The Sioux surmised it must be a holy road to have such protection, and had given their word to the officers that they wouldn't bring harm to the white travelers. Shortly after, a council gathering of some 5,000 Plains Indian representatives signed a treaty at Fort Laramie in 1851 to guarantee safe passage to the westbound travelers. Another 3,000 women and children were present to exchange and trade goods. In return, the Sioux leaders requested that Paha Sapa, their sacred land, remain off-limits to the whites. Throughout the 1850s, the Plains Indians tried to hold fast to the lifestyle they knew, always waiting, watching for a sign of Tatanka. They moved their encampments from place to place, desperate to find the Tatanka that were disappearing in vast numbers. Strikes the Ree remained active in his quest for peace. He was greatly concerned for the safety of his people as more conflicts ignited between settlers and factions of Indians. Other whites talked of a peace treaty, with promises of food and annuities for the Sioux. Seeing the desperate conditions of his people, Strikes the Ree struggled deeply to make the right decision. If they didn't sign the treaty, the thought of war with the U.S. cavalry and their long rifles presented a bleak picture. How many more Yanktons must die, he wondered. With heavy hearts, the chiefs tried to foresee the impending future for their descendants. After much deliberation, the chiefs and elders felt their options dwindling. Strikes the Ree then traveled to Washington, D.C. His name was the first of 14 Yankton Sioux representatives listed on the Yankton Sioux Treaty of 1858. In the end, the Yankton Sioux gave up their lands in return for trade goods, retaining their annuity rights from the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty intended to end the Indian Wars and establish protection of the American Indians by the U.S. government. Within a few months, over 2,000 teepees crowded the 40,000-acre tract of land, and soon they were out of wildlife to hunt within the restricted borders. The traditional foods, like berries or roots, were also gone. Suddenly, the tribe was solely dependent on the government rations. Strikes the Ree went one step further than any other American Indian had at the time. Maybe his chance encounter at birth with Captains Lewis and Clark foreshadowed his future. At 55 years of age, he became the first American Indian citizen of the United States. He then requested an American flag for the first Indian agency at Greenwood, South Dakota, never giving up on the idea of peaceful solutions. For his continued efforts in pursuing peace, Strikes the Ree received medals from 3 U.S. presidents: Franklin Pierce, Ulysses S. Grant, and James Garfield. The peace, however, was short-lived. In 1862, the Homestead Act unleashed a flurry of settlers across the plains. Although hated by some of his own kind, Strikes the Ree continued his efforts to quash the conflicts. In that same year, he advised his militant young warriors not to join the ill-fated Sante uprising to the east, where the Dakota bands were facing starvation. His main goal was to save their lives and at the same time protect some of the innocent white settlers. Meanwhile, a few years later, Red Leggings moved north and west to the Lower Brule encampment with his wife, Many Husbands. She'd earned the name because she had outlived several husbands. Early one morning in the year 1863, she gave birth to a baby in the women's teepee. The women attending Many Husbands then cleaned the tiny infant and carried him to the encampment to show Red Leggings his new baby, a son who would carry the promise of strength and great character. As Red Leggings held his son up high to thank the Creator for the gift of life, the baby cried out. Because his voice was so loud, he was named Hotanka, meaning big voice. In accordance with Sioux tradition, every adult in Hotanka's extended family circle contributed to his development as he grew and matured. Some acted as teachers, others nurturers and caregivers, and still others taught him the ways of a skilled hunter. Isolated conflicts were now commonplace as wagon trains, army patrols, and civilians all pushed their way into Indian territory. The 7 bands of the Lakota had no way to know they were on the cusp of such dramatic changes. Red Leggings and the other warriors fought hard to protect their village, but the U.S. soldiers were better equipped with rifles and ammunition. Through dangerous and often deadly encounters, the tribal leaders came to the realization that some of the officers were determined to crush the bands of people into submission, and nothing would stop them from doing so. The mere image of a man dressed in the dark blue of the U.S. cavalry, with the gold buttons and trim, and the distinctive navy cap with 2 gold swords crossed in the front, brought a sickening fear for the women and children. By now, the iron horse smoked and roared across the plains, and the buffalo herds had shrunk drastically. Red Leggings and his people were devastated to see thousands of Tatanka killed and left to rot in the open prairie. Why, they wondered, would someone do such a thing? To calm the fears of the settlers, the government ordered the army to force the Indians who remained onto small reservations. Many had no choice but to submit. Red leggings joined the discontented conversations in the council lodge. Some of the neighboring tribes had fled north to Canada. Others wanted to keep fighting. Some, though, were happy to take the trade goods offered by the officers, coveting the items, content to let the wool blankets replace the buffalo robes as the preferred winter garment. During the harsh months of Teobianka-wee, which is frost in the lodge, and Kananpopa-wee, which is popping trees, January and February, the days were bitter cold and the food supply ran low. Yet the promises of food and rations were not fulfilled. With spirits crushed, many Lakota consented to go to the reservation. In 1874, when Hotonka was only 11 years old, word came to their camp that Pihenhanshka, or General George A. Custer, was leading an expedition into Pahasapa. Known for his shoulder-length blonde hair, the Sioux referred to him as Longhair. Brash and high-spirited, Custer brought 1,000 troops with him under the pretense of looking for a place to build a fort. The truth, however, was much different. They were looking for gold. Suddenly, a stampede of fortune hunters and prospectors descended on Pahasapa, breaking the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1856. The army and government did nothing to keep the miners off the sacred spiritual lands of the Sioux as they had promised. The Sioux watched as more and more men arrived to chase after the yellow dust in the hills. A Senate commission created to negotiate the treaty prepared to offer $6 million for Pahasapa. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other defiant warriors refused to participate, unwilling to discuss a sale of their most sacred place. No price was high enough. After all, Inamaka, Mother Earth, belonged to all and could not be bought or sold. Within 2 short years, all of the Indian bands were ordered to return to their reservation or be considered hostiles. The 7th Cavalry, under General George A. Custer, was ordered to bring the Sioux bands in and place them on the reservation lands. Great Sioux leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to be permanently confined to reservations. They were prepared to defend their hunting camps against the U.S. Army and Longhair, launching one of the most memorable conflicts with the United States Cavalry. The Lakota Nation, along with their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, gathered at a place called Greasy Grass. Sensing the enormity of the impending battle, Sitting Bull desperately prayed to Wakantanka to save his people. Rather than let his men rest after their long journey, Custer pushed his weary troops to a place called Little Bighorn, Montana, where his troops had spotted the Sioux. Wearing his trademark buckskin uniform, Custer wasted no time and immediately attacked, unknowingly outnumbered 4-1. Warriors were waiting and ready. The Sioux forces joined together with Sitting Bull in the lead and headed straight for Longhair. In a relatively short time, the Sioux nation of 2,500 warriors won a major victory over Custer and his 7th Cavalry. The victory was short-lived. Once word got back to Washington that warriors with such strange names like Low Dog, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull defeated such a decorated soldier, the whites demanded more action. It wasn't long before an even bigger army of bluecoats relentlessly pursued the Indians. In retribution, Congress took back the Black Hills despite the treaty, and in addition, took another 40 million acres of Lakota land. The great Sioux nation then scattered, with some moving to Canada. By 1877, the United States government formally demanded that the Lakota Nation move to the reservations. Between the allotment acts and other government policies, the reservations were carved up and cut back dramatically in size. Missionaries and boarding schools sprung up as a way to civilize the hostiles. Hotanka was now a young man in his teens when the white men came up the Missouri River to Chamberlain, offering to take Indian children back east to the Hampton Institute. Red Leggins was afraid for his son because of all that had taken place, and told him not to go. 15-year-old Hotanka knew the Indian way of life was gone forever, and he understood the pain in his father's eyes. Something inside Hotanka told him that his only chance was to keep up with the new ways of the white man. Hotanka snuck away one night and got on the riverboat despite his father's pleas. Many days later, Hotanka arrived at the Hampton Institute with other Indian children in a faraway place called Virginia. The instructors in charge asked him to give his name, and he proudly said, "Hotanka, big voice." The instructors shook their head disapprovingly and asked for his father's name. He said, "Red Leggins." They shook their heads again. "Pick one of the English names so we can pronounce it," they ordered. Hotanka listened as they read the names he could choose from, and he picked Thompson. From that day forward, Hotanka, big voice, was known as Joseph Thompson. Next, the staff looked disapprovingly at his shiny black hair that fell down his back. Joseph, along with all the other young boys, was taken into a small room where men with sharp silver blades cut their hair short like the white men. All the students were given uniforms to wear, and their soft moccasins were replaced with hard shoes. Joseph had come to the Institute for far bigger reasons than clothes and shoes. He could no longer hunt the buffalo like his father. He was here to learn a new trade. For half the day, the boarding school teachers taught formal academic subjects. The other half of the day was spent on vocational skills. Since the federal government never provided enough money or staff, Joseph and the other students often spent more time cleaning, cooking, sewing, and laundering than they did in the classroom. In his 3 years at the Institute, Joseph learned 5 trades in all: bookkeeping, tinsmithing, blacksmithing, carpentry, and wheelwright. He returned to the Lower Brule area after finishing school. The traditional village was gone, but those who remained strived to keep a sense of the Lakota spirit, hosting frequent gatherings, dances, weddings, and giveaways. When he was 21, Joseph married Mary Little Elk, only 17, a beautiful young woman who was half white and half Lakota from Lower Brule. Her father was a soldier in the cavalry, and sometimes she was called a Kichita Wingyan, or soldier woman. She was so beautiful, in fact, he had to pay 2 horses for her instead of the usual 1. Joseph was happy to be back on the gentle, rolling prairie. He and Mary settled in Fort George. Although the actual fort was gone, the name stuck to the area, which was about 20 miles from Fort Pierre and Pierre. Joseph and Mary did their best to adapt to the new ways, sensing a bright dawn of better days ahead. Mary never learned English, but she loved to sing hymns in Lakota on Sundays at Holy Name Chapel, the tiny Episcopal church in Fort George. In the early years, Joseph made furniture and went in search of a place to sell his goods. Sometimes he brought them down to the riverboat and headed south on the Missouri River. He tried to be an example to other Indians, demonstrating how his education helped their family and could lead others to a better way of living. Joseph also worked as a pony express rider and mail carrier on the trail from Owacoma to Fort Pierre. One time, he was carrying the payroll on his route, and a small band of robbers started chasing him. Outnumbered, he guided his horse into the deep river and swam to the other side. In doing so, he lost the outlaws and continued his ride into Fort Pierre from the other side. In 1890, Joseph Thompson and the others heard of the horror against Chief Bigfoot's band, then camped at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. In an attempt to disarm the band, the cavalry massacred over 300 Indians, mostly women and children, on December 29th. To add to the terror, a blizzard struck the very next day, freezing many of the bodies into horrifying positions. Life on the South Dakota plains was harsh for many of the white settlers, unaccustomed to the barren conditions and long winters. Since wood was scarce on the treeless prairie, homes were made with blocks of prairie sod for walls, with earth roofs and dirt floors. Another option was to build tar paper shacks that sometimes sprouted up near the railroad. Either way, the bare structures were often erected in the middle of nowhere, leaving the women and children isolated while the men were off hunting game. The most constant companion was the wind, blowing up dust, dirt, or snow throughout the long and lonely months. The only fuel readily available to hold off winter's frigid chill was cow and buffalo chips or twisted strands of hay. Life was good, but not easy for Joseph and Mary. As the 5 children came along, there were times of great sadness. Baby Esther died as an infant, and her sister Josephine died when she was only 12. Bessie grew up and married, but died as a young mother. Joseph and Mary then raised Bessie's children, Meta and Henry Goodface. Only sons Harry and Benjamin were left to carry on the Thompson name. Joseph rode his beloved horses until the age of 75, when his son Ben told him it was time to quit. When Ben was a young boy, the schools were run like a military academy, with strictly enforced rules. He was instructed to forget the Indian ways and learn everything about the white man's ways. For example, students were forbidden to speak Lakota. If they did, they faced severe punishments. Many of the surrounding reservations were changing, physically, mentally, morally, spiritually, socially, and economically. It was a new era for the American Indian. Around the country, the general consensus was that the Indians were a problem. No jobs were available, so many continued to hunt and fish and gather what they could, but it was not enough to sustain them. The Indian families looked forward to issue day because it was a chance to visit friends and relatives and trade items. Blankets, yards of cloth, shoes, and farm equipment were also available. They often stood in long lines to collect their rations at a time when Congress slashed funding, resulting in shortages. Ben Thompson grew up and married Ruth Walton, a young woman who came from Peoria, Oklahoma, to work at the boarding school. They too settled in Fort George in one of the little houses that lined the creek. There they raised their 8 children: Ben, Arlene, Joe, Muffet, Esther, Bill, Majel, and Winona, while enduring a different type of struggle throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Life at home was simple but good. Piano music could often be heard coming from the tiny frame house, and all the kids knew the Missouri Waltz was their mother's favorite song. Faithfully, every Sunday, Ruth played the organ at Holy Name Chapel. Ben raised horses and became known for having teams and wagons for sale. Sometimes he was paid in gold for his fine teams. "Look at these, kids," he'd say, rolling the shiny nuggets in his palms. Ben chose to dress more like a cowboy than an Indian and became skilled at branding cattle. During Roundup, ranchers came from all over to help, bringing their own pup tents along for nightly cover. As the years went by, Ben ended up with a herd of 1,400 horses. When the time came, he took only 3 men on horseback to drive all the 1,400 head from Fort George to Presho to sell the horses to the army. Those who saw it say it was a beautiful sight to see the whole drove of mustangs galloping and kicking up dirt, coming over the hills, racing towards the Missouri to drink. The horses came in all shades of white, tan, brown, spotted and painted, streaming over the hills like pouring sand, heads raised high, manes and tails flying. Magnificent and majestic, they galloped at full speed, their muscled legs carrying them in harmonious motion. Some of the open-range horses belonged to neighboring ranches, so they had to be branded. Ben picked out the ones that made good saddle horses and team horses before continuing down to Presho. Sometimes Unsi, Grandma Mary, and Lala, Grandpa Joseph, took the grandkids with them on a trip down to Lower Brule to trade and purchase supplies. With a team and wagon, the distance required an overnight stay, so they'd spend the night at John Small-Waisted Bear's house about halfway. Little Esther and Meta danced for the adults while John played the skillet, the only available musical instrument. Joseph made tin cups to sell and usually brought several gunny sacks filled with shaved willow tobacco. When the wagon was full coming home, the kids could count on walking up Cedar Creek Hill to lighten the load up the steep incline for the horses. Unsi Mary took Arlene and Esther along digging for wild turnips in the spring. She showed her granddaughters how to make patties from wild chokecherries. After the berries were picked and washed, she'd put them in a leather bowl and pound them up real fine, seeds and all. Next, they'd form the patties and dry them on a screen in the sun before storing them for winter. The girls loved to reach in the basket for a piece of fry bread and cover it with the red berry sauce, their favorite afternoon treat. "Delicious, Unsi," they cried in unison. It was well known that Unsi Mary's chokecherries made the best wojapi sauce. On lazy afternoons, the kids played with bone horses, pieces of bones that were shaped like little horses. Matches and string made the fence to keep the horses in the corral. In the winter, Ben harvested ice from the river, cutting big blocks of ice. He'd get sawdust from the neighbor who ran a sawmill, Tom Summers. Tom and Ben then packed the sawdust around the ice blocks in an ice house built into the side of a hill. In their later years, Ben and Ruth moved near Chamberlain, where Ben worked as a manager of the farm program for the tribe. Eventually, they returned to Fort George, where the older children were now young adults. By now, Arlene was an outgoing young woman, not at all afraid to take charge in a situation, just like deciding as a little girl to go by her middle name, Arlene, rather than her first name, Bessie. Following high school, she attended the Haskell Indian Training School in Lawrence, Kansas. After completing a business course, she returned to Lower Brule and worked in the tribal office. A handsome young man with a charming smile caught her attention, and before long, Fred LaRoche proposed to Arlene. Fred was a great baseball player and even had a chance to play semi-pro ball in Minneapolis. But he missed the rolling prairie and open lands and came back to South Dakota. The young couple liked to dress up and go out on special occasions. Arlene's favorite photo was taken one night at a carnival. She was wearing her best dress with a string of pearls, and her hair was curled perfectly. Fred looked most stunning with his black hair slicked straight back, his distinctive jaw set in place. Their cheeks almost touched as the flash recorded their special moment. Unlike some couples, they could at least afford a car, so family and friends often accompanied them on trips to town. Fred joined the Navy during World War II and served his stint aboard a Navy vessel as a firefighter. Later, Fred and Arlene moved to Fort George, where Fred tried his hand at ranching. Just like her mother, Arlene was a wonderful seamstress and cook as she and Fred started their own family. 2 little girls, Fanchon and Susie, came first, both adorably cute with round cheeks and sweet smiles. Fred loved singing to the girls when they were little, while Arlene sewed calico print dresses with the cap sleeves and round collars. Before long, the girls started school, first at the Cheyenne River Sioux boarding school, and later at the Pierre Indian School. Arlene stayed busy running the house because it seemed there was always a cousin or an aunt or an uncle living with them, along with 3 or 4 of their kids. The years passed, and late one evening Arlene headed to Lower Brule from Fort George all alone, a route she'd traveled numerous times. On this November night, Arlene's thoughts were in turmoil. She had a difficult decision to make, and she simply could not confide in anyone, not even her mother or her husband. The reservation road was desolate on that wintry evening, and the cold easily penetrated the crack next to the starter on the floorboard. All around her, moonlight flooded the prairie, reflecting on the light dusting of snow that covered the pasture grasses. Her eyes were drawn to the full moon rising just above the rounded edge of the distant bluff. Amber in color, it shone clear and bright, silhouetting the rolling prairie. The single pair of headlights caught a rabbit as it scurried across the road and disappeared into the ditch. Arlene slowed her speed and stayed in the middle of the gravel road to avoid the rigid ruts along the side as the old Chevy bounced along. She knew she only had a few more weeks before the baby inside her would begin to grow. The girls were getting older. Fanchon was 16 and Susie was 11, but they were mostly away at school. So many things had changed. If only the answers were as clear as the moon above. Like a valuable ornament of gold, it exquisitely adorned the night sky. A prominent sphere boldly declared on this night that no clouds could hide its precious light. Hide. The thought crossed her mind with a newfound meaning, and she blinked back the tears. Maybe no one would have to know.